Man, it is so weird having like actual lighting the first time in a while. Anyways, hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Ship and Read. Today I'll be doing my February wrap up. So this is kind of late. It's already like end of March, but I'm finally getting around to it because I read a lot of books in February that took me some time to kind of just gather all the notes and prep for this video. But yeah, let's just get right into the stats for February. So just some quick stats for February. In February, I managed to read 14 books, which is amazing compared to what I've been reading previously. So yeah, I am pretty excited about that. And out of the 14 books that I read 2 5-star books, 2 4.5-star books, 3 4 stars, 3 3.5 stars, 1 3-star, 2 2.5-star books, and 1 2-star books. So honestly, I would say that for the most part, February was pretty good. A lot of my books were about 3 stars and up. Obviously there was a few that were not so great, but overall pretty decent month, especially in terms of the quantity of books that I read. In terms of the quality, I would say it's like average, but not too bad overall. Honestly, I don't know if this is like too bright for me right now. I feel like my face looks so pale, but whatever. I'm just gonna like move on and continue with this video. I'm just not used to having like artificial lighting right now because I've been using natural light from my window for filming, but because I'm filming kind of early right now, like early or like late morning, it's not fully bright out right now, plus it's also raining. So I was like, I guess I'm not going to be using natural light today because it's not going to be good. So I'm using my actual light that I purchased like months ago for the first time. And so yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you think about this lighting, guys. If it looks good, I'll continue to use this in the future videos, but I have noticed that some of my videos have been a little bit dark just because of like rainy or just like an overcast day. Like in person didn't look that dark, but then when I was editing, I was like, I do look a little bit dark here. It's not as light as I would like. But yeah, let me know down below about the lighting issue, if it looks good, if I should continue with this artificial light coming in, or if I should continue using my natural light instead. This is my window. That's the light, in case you're wondering where I'm pointing at. But anyways, before I get too sidetracked, let's get on with the books. So these aren't in any particular order, but the first book that I want to discuss today is Anxious People by Frederick Backman. This one I gave 2.5 stars. So I did talk about this book a lot more in detail in my Goodreads Best Fiction Reading vlog, so I will link that somewhere above and below in case you want to check that out. But this book basically follows a bank robber where he decides to rob a bank and ends up going terribly wrong because the bank robber decides to rob a cashless bank. And I guess cashless banks are banks where there's no cash. Everything is digital transactions. So obviously doesn't go as planned, and somehow the bank robber ends up running off, escaping, and running upstairs and ends up at an apartment where they're doing an open house. And then what happens after that is that there is now a hostage situation where the bank robber decides to, you know, have everyone in the open house under hostage while also trying to escape and discussing with the police. So this book is set in alternating timelines where part of the book takes place after the hostages has been released and they are interviewing and discussing with the policemen, and the other half is during the whole hostage situation and what actually happened during that time period. This book was really hard to get into. I read this back to back with Beartown, and Beartown was just such an emotional, heartbreaking book to read, and this one, I don't know, I just felt like the characters were just such idiots. It took me a really long time to actually start to like them, and I feel like just because I read back to back with Beartown, it was just so different in terms of the topic as well as the writing style that I don't know, I just feel like Frederick Backman just has very like polarizing writing styles that it's hard to decide if I like his writing or not. But in terms of Anxious People, this was just not the book for me. Then moving on to A Court of Rings and Ruin, as well as A Court of Frost and Starlight by Sarah J. Maas. Both of these books I gave 5 stars. So I'm not going to go too much in terms of what these books are about because A Court of Rings and Ruin is the 3rd book of the trilogy, and A Court of Frost and Starlight is a novella after the trilogy, kind of leading up to her new series. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but it just kind of follows the aftermath of what happens in the first 2 books, and then in the novella kind of follows all the characters during the winter solstice. So obviously I enjoyed both books very much. I gave them both 5 stars. And then for A Court of Rings and Ruin, it was actually a reread, so obviously I loved that book in the beginning, still love it after I reread it, and then I was reading the novella for the first time, which I also really enjoyed. It definitely gave me some different opinions in terms of some of the characters, but upon reflection I was like, I can kind of see where they're coming from, but at the same time I was still like, I don't know, like I just feel like I can't, for me personally, I just can't fully grasp some of what they were going through, like especially the aftermath of what happened after the trilogy and why they were reacting the way that they were in the novella. So yeah, that's all I can really say for this. But I do have the new book. I managed to get a copy of it recently, so I am going to read it soon and then hopefully continue on with the series. Then this next book that I read is Midnight Library, which I gave 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. I also discussed this book a little bit more in my best fiction Goodreads reading vlog, so again I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this book was just so unique. It follows Nora, who finds herself in a life where no one really wants her, no one really needs her, and she doesn't seem to really fit in anywhere with no goals or dreams. So very early on in the book, and within the first chapter or two, she ends up committing suicide, so definitely trigger warning there. And she finds herself in a library that is set between life and death, where there are rows and rows upon books, and each book contains a different version of her reality, where if she had taken a different choice in her life, where it would lead up to today. So now she is traveling within this midnight library to see which of her life is actually worth living and what exactly makes life worth living for. This book was so captivating. I was so enraptured with the writing style, the contents, the plot, the characters, like everything about this book was just so riveting. It was also a really fast read. I could have easily finished this book in one sitting, but I wanted to just kind of savor it a bit, so I did take like maybe 2 or 3 days to read it, but I loved it. It was just so good. The one thing that stood out to me the most was just how one tiny little decision in your life can make such a huge impact with how your life ends up. And I feel like that is just kind of crazy to see, like something that you don't ever consider, like, you know, just crossing the street, for example, or like saying yes to a coffee date or something like that, will have just been so monumental in how your life would have changed. And honestly, this book would have been a solid 5-star read if it wasn't for this one little thing about the ending that I mean, I still enjoyed how the book ended and I can see where the author is coming from, but I personally was like, I felt like there was one choice, like one life in particular, that I really thought was perfect. But you know, things didn't work out the way how I wanted to work out. But I felt like this book did have a lot of good messages in terms of like life and your dreams, your aspirations, and what really does make life worth living for. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I can definitely see why it was the winner for the Goodreads Choice Award, because it was just so good. Like sometimes I feel like the winners are kind of overrated, but in this particular case it was well warranted. So yeah, definitely pick up this book if you haven't already. Then this next book that I want to discuss is Echo Wife. This one I gave 2.5 stars. So I actually read this book in my February ARC reading vlog, so I'll link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this book has such a unique premise because it follows a woman who finds out that her husband is actually cheating on her clone, and something happens pretty early on in the book where she now finds her ex-husband dead, and now she and this clone are trying to figure out what to do after that. The biggest issue with this book, I think, was just the unlikable characters. I really did not like the main character at all. I found her to be very selfish, very self-absorbed, wasn't really considerate about anyone around her. But the thing is, like, she was so standoffish. Like, I can see where she's coming from. She's very smart. She's very intelligent. She literally invented the whole cloning system and like having it perfected. So she kind of had that like genius aloofness to her because she was incredibly smart, very successful in her career, but didn't really do so well in her marriage. So for me, I wasn't a huge fan of the main character just because I felt like she was just so self-centered really, and I just did not like her character. Like, her character and I just did not vibe, okay? But I had a lot of theories about this book in terms of like where it was going and what was going to happen. Obviously I was wrong in every single aspect of it, but the ending still really surprised me. I definitely didn't expect that at all. So overall, like, while the premise was interesting and there were some intriguing elements to this book and the ending was kind of surprising, I didn't love it at the end of the day. I think it was just because of the main character and just I really didn't like her. But the next book that I want to discuss is Cinderella is Dead, which I gave 2 stars. So this book takes place 200 years after the original Cinderella story, and it is now mandatory for girls at a certain age to attend the annual ball. And the whole point of this ball is to find a husband. And if the girl is unsuccessful in finding her match, she is never heard from again. And this book follows a girl called Sophia, where she has now reached an age where it is mandatory for her to attend the ball, but she much rather spend her years with Aaron, her childhood best friend. Unfortunately though, she has no say, and for the safety of her family, she ends up going to the ball anyway, and things go awry. And somehow at the ball, she ends up running into Constance, who is actually the last living descendant of Cinderella, and together the two of them think of a way to take down the king forever. The best part about this book was a great diverse representation. There were a lot of ethnic diversity in here, a lot of LGBT diversity in here as well. There are so many different types of characters involved in here. But that was kind of the only redeeming factor about this book. I hated the romance. I felt like the romance was a huge part of this book, but the whole interaction between Sophia and Aaron just felt so one-sided. Like Sophia the entire time was just like, Aaron, we should be together, let's fight for each other, and let's just run away and just be together forever and ever. And Aaron was just like, hell no, like I don't want to do that. You know, like she was just not into it. So the whole relationship already started off very one-sided, where it was all Sophia chasing after Aaron and Aaron wanting nothing to do with her at all. So it was to the point where I was like, were they even together, or was this all Sophia's thinking that they were together? Because Aaron didn't even seem to really care about her in the book, that I was just like, I felt like this was a very one-sided relationship. And the thing is, like, as much as Sophia was claiming how much she loved Aaron, how much they were meant to be together, and how they should fight so much for each other, etc, etc, once she met Constance, it was like, bye Aaron, let's go with Constance now. That I was like, I don't know, it just felt very, like the feelings that Sophia had for Aaron just seemed so shallow. I mean, so much for loyalty, right? And the thing is, like, I also found Sophia to be so brash and reckless in terms of like her own safety or even her family's safety, especially in a world like this area. This place that she grew up in is a place where females have absolutely no say whatsoever. It's all about the men. And so for me, I'm like, you grew up in a place where it's like that, and even your mom is like, you know, you need to be careful, like watch what you say, watch what you do, etc, etc. And it just felt like she had no regard to her family or her friends' safety, or even to her own safety really. And the last thing that I didn't like with this book was the world building. There was absolutely none whatsoever. There were a lot of questions left unanswered in terms of the magic system, in terms of the fairy godmother, etc, etc. So overall, like, it was just the great diverse representation, but that was really it. Then this next book is The Score, which I gave 4 stars. This book follows Allie, who is struggling to figure out what she wants to do after college, and Dean, who is a super charming football player who has never had a woman say no to him before. So nursing a broken heart after a breakup, Allie somehow ends up in bed with Dean for a wild rebound sex, and now she kind of wants nothing really to do with him. However, unfortunately for her, Dean hasn't had enough of her yet, and he decides to turn on the charms for her. So this is definitely a college new adult type of book, very smutty, very romance, very heavy on the romance, and I actually really enjoyed it. It was such a good time for me. It was just a really super fun, entertaining read. And the book also had some surprising depth to it in terms of family relationships and dynamics, which I wasn't expecting. I feel like for me, these type of books, I tend to just be like, okay, it's going to be about sex 90% of the time, but for this book, I would say yes, there was a lot of funny scenes to it, and yes, there were a lot of like sex scenes to it, but it also had a lot more than just that. It also had some really likable characters. Like, I was completely charmed by Dean as well. Like, he wasn't just your average playboy, I guess, you know. He actually really cared about kids and about giving back to the community, and it was something that I really liked as a character. So yeah, this book was just really good. I definitely want to continue the series. This was book 3, I believe, and there's going to be, I think there's like a 4th book in here. I don't know if there's a 5th or anything like that, but I'm going to try to finish the series. So overall, really enjoyed this book, definitely recommend it if you're looking for like a really fun, smutty, new adult type of book with some surprising good elements to it as well. Then the next book that I want to discuss is From Blood and Ash, which I gave 3.5 stars. I also discussed this book much more in detail in my best romance Goodreads reading vlog, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this book follows a maiden who has been kept cloistered her entire life due to the fact that she is the sole survivor of a craven attack and thus deemed special. She encounters a well-known guard called Hawks, who somehow, due to circumstances, ends up up as her personal royal bodyguard. And in the meantime, there is a lot of political and religious differences in her kingdom, and as the book continues, she finds herself in the midst of it all. This book was kind of disappointing. It just was not up to my expectations compared to my other experiences with Jennifer L. Armentrout books. I just expected a lot more action, a lot more smut, a lot more romance, and that was not the case with this book. My biggest issue is actually the world building. I felt like it was kind of lacking. I think this was her first full-on fantasy book. All of her other books previously have been urban fantasy, so I don't know, maybe that's the reason why, but I felt like the world building had a lot of questions left unanswered in terms of what was actually going on, what were the different like terms that she was using, and it took me a really long time to fully grasp the differences between the religious and political aspects. And I felt like because it took me a long time, it took away my enjoyment of the book. Like I felt like if I had understood this earlier on, the book would have made a lot more sense for me rather than figuring things out at the very end. So I don't know if I'm going to continue with this book, to be honest, because I was kind of like meh about it, and I feel like I have so many books, like all of these books I need to read. So yeah, I don't know, I haven't really decided yet, but I was pretty disappointed with this book. Then the next book I want to discuss is Beach Read, which I gave 4 stars. So this book follows 2 rival authors who are dealing with some sort of writer's block, and they somehow end up as neighbors at their beach houses. The 2 of them decide to swap genres. One of them writes literary fiction, the other one writes romance, to see if maybe by swapping genres they will be able to overcome their writer's block. And of course, as the book continues, they end up falling in love. I did talk about this book a lot more in detail in my Goodreads romance reading vlog, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. This book was super freaking cute. I really enjoyed it. The cutest part for me was when they were going on their weekly adventures, because part of their agreement was to kind of help each other understand their genre a little bit more, so they weren't just like deep diving into a new completely genre to write about with no advice and tips. So their whole weekly adventures was to provide each other advice and tips on how they can write their respective genres, and I felt like their adventures were just so adorable to read about. So overall, it was just a very entertaining novel, and I definitely want to read more of her books in the future. Then this next book that I want to talk about is Electric Kingdom. This one I gave 3 stars. I also discussed this book a lot more in detail in my February arcs reading vlog, so again I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this book follows a deadly fly food that has ravaged the entire world, and now there's only a few survivors left. One of them is Nico and her dog as they try to travel and find this mythical portal, and the other is Kit, who is a young boy and ends up crossing paths with Nico. And the other is called the Deliverer, who has been living life over and over again in hopes of saving the world. This was really confusing. My first thought was that this is a very simple dystopian apocalyptic kind of book, or post-apocalyptic type of book, where, you know, this apocalypse occurred and now they're trying to survive and continue and figure out like how they can survive in this world, potentially fix it, etc. That wasn't really the case with this book at all. There ended up being so much more, and I can't really go into detail because obviously spoilers. All I can say is that the cover makes a lot more sense. Not only that, but the ending was also very vague, and again, like I mentioned multiple times, I do not like vague endings. So overall, I was just not super pleased about this book. It was just an okay read, but that was kind of it. Then this next book that I want to discuss is How the King of Elheim Learned to Hate Stories by Holly Black. This one I gave 4 stars. So this is a collection of short stories where it follows Carden as a child, as well as a few stories that took place during the trilogy, as well as another story that took place after. But these are all stories from his perspective. Overall, I enjoyed it. It was kind of interesting to see like the insight of his perspectives during the trilogy, as well as the stories when he was a child, and kind of understanding like where he was coming from the start of the trilogy because of his childhood. I do wish there was more than just one story about Jude and Carden after the trilogy ended, because I just want to know more about the 2 of them. So I'm still really hoping that there will be some sort of like continuation trilogy, like a series, or maybe even like a spin-off series where it follows like different characters but also has Jude and Carden, because I just really wanted to have more of them. So yeah, overall I really enjoyed this book. Then this next book that I want to discuss is The Switch by Beth O'Leary. This one I gave 3.5 stars. This book follows Eileen, who is a 70-year-old grandmother who ends up switching places with her granddaughter Lena, who is in her 20s. Eileen is recently divorced and she's been trying to find romance and love in her small country town, whereas Lena is a successful young woman living in London who has been struggling to cope with her sister's death and ends up having a complete breakdown at a company presentation. So because of circumstances, the two of them decide to switch places. Lena wants a change of pace, so she ends up going to the countryside, and Eileen, who wants to find romance, ends up going to London, where there are a lot more eligible 70-year-old men. So at first I didn't realize that the switch was between a grandmother and her granddaughter. I mean, I knew that there was going to be like a grandmother and a granddaughter. I just didn't realize they were related. I felt like that kind of like changed my perspective a little bit about this book, but I don't know if having strangers switching places would have been more preferable compared to family members, but it definitely threw me off a little bit. So I would say that this book, everything seemed very happy and in a way kind of cheesy as well, especially for certain parts of this book that seemed like a Hallmark movie. And the book overall was just very cute, and it did deal lightly on some harder topics such as grief and family loss. Then this next book that I want to discuss is Our Last Echoes, which I gave 3.5 stars. I discussed this book a lot more in detail in my March arc reading vlog, so I will link that somewhere above and down below in case you want to check that out. So this book follows a girl called Sophia, where all she could remember was drowning and her mother pulling her to safety before it was too late. But the thing is, Sophia has never been to the ocean and her mother died at a hospital. However, things all change when she receives clues that ends up leading her to a little island called Bitter Rock, and there she finds out about all of these disappearances that have happened over the years, including her own, and now she's trying to figure out what really happened. This book started off so strong. I was so invested with what was going on. It was so atmospheric, lots of creepy elements to it, a lot of mystery involved, but as the book continued, things really started to peter out and kind of died down a little bit, and it was to the point that the book was starting to lose its momentum and I was starting to get a little bored. But the ending, I have to say, really redeemed itself because I got so intrigued by what was going to happen, and I feel like there would definitely be a third book. While Rules of Vanishing and this book are not actually series, they're like standalone books, they are related. I think they're set in the same world or something like that. So the way how this book ended, I'm pretty sure the third book will also follow or like take place in the same world, and it will be like somewhat related. I think they're still standalones, but there's going to be like some references to her earlier books. So ending definitely got me intrigued. I definitely want to continue and see what happens in this third book. Then this last book that I want to discuss is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. This one I gave 4.5 stars. So this book takes place about 2 years after the end of the first book, where Vin and her friends are now figuring out how to build a healthy new society while also facing 3 armies right outside their city who are trying to take the city for themselves. This book definitely started off kind of slow, and it was a lot more politically focused, especially in the first half of this book. And because I took some time between reading the first book and this book, it took me some time to kind of like relearn all the characters and the magic system all over again. But I feel like Brandon Sanderson did a really good job kind of like rehashing all that and recapping everything that happened in the first book in this book. So it took me very little time to fall in love with characters and fall in love with the story all over again. So once that happened, I was immediately invested all over again and couldn't wait to find out what was going to happen next. And with the end of this book, there are so many more questions left unanswered that I definitely want to read the third book, the final book in the series, as soon as possible. Once I'm done with the original trilogy, I want to move on to the second half of the trilogy and then kind of see like what happens after that. But yeah, I definitely love this book. I can see why this book just still is amazing after so many years, and why I definitely want to continue reading his books in the future. So anyways, these are all the books I want to discuss in this video. This is so long, like 14 books to discuss was it just took me so long, guys. But yeah, that's all to say for this video. Let me know down below how your February reading was like. Were there any new favorites of yours? Have you read any of the books I mentioned in this video? Let me know down below what were your thoughts. But as always, if you do like this video, please do give me a thumbs up. It really does help out my channel. And as always, if you'd like to see more content of me, please do subscribe and hit the notification bell. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!